research tip, I would watch some regular people use your website to buy something. And I don't mean employees who've been pushed into doing it or professional testers who work for testing companies. Find some typical people. But I would have people who aren't familiar with the company, aren't familiar with the website, try and accomplish a task there and observe them carefully and watch where they get stuck. You're going to find...
Welcome, everyone. I'm your host, DJ Sprague. My co-host, Scott Branley, is out today. We have a special guest, Roger Dooley. How are you doing today, Roger?
Doing great, DJ. Thanks for having me on the show.
We're so excited, honestly. Huge fan, big follower. I've read 2 of your 3 books. But in any case, I'd love to introduce you to our audience for those that don't know you or don't know your background as well as I do. Roger Dooley is a keynote speaker. He's a marketing consultant and Forbes contributor. He founded his own consultancy firm, Dooley Direct, and was also a co-founder of College Confidential, which was recently acquired by Hobson's. He spent years in direct marketing and started a successful catalog sales business. Roger Dooley also worked as a director of corporate planning for Hobson's, a Fortune 1000 company. He's the author of Friction, named a Best Business Book of 2019 by Strategy Plus Business. He also wrote Brainfluence and the Persuasion Slide. He also created behavioral science and neuromarketing courses on the CXL platform, which, by the way, I've been watching and they're fantastic. Roger Dooley is a Carnegie Mellon University and University of Tennessee graduate. So once again, welcome to the episode, Roger. It's really exciting to have you here.
Well, again, thanks for having me on, DJ.
So tell us, how did you get into behavioral science? What was that path?
Well, I guess the roots go very deep. I studied originally as an engineer, chemical engineer of all things. Despite that, I minored in psychology and actually took a course in psychology of persuasion way back when. This was before Influence came out, if you can imagine that. I don't know what we use for a textbook. I've tried to figure that out, but I haven't been able to. So those roots run kind of deep, but were dormant for decades. Actually, about 20 years ago now, I saw a couple of areas coming together, which were marketing and neuroscience. So being a digital marketing guy, said, well, I ought to grab a domain, which I did, neurosciencemarketing.com. And I started writing there. And initially, my focus was on sort of the hardcore tools of neuroscience to improve marketing. That is, doing things like fMRI studies or EEG studies, using biometric measurements and so on to gauge how people were responding to advertising and marketing, packaging, and so on. But what I found was there was a lot more interest when I talked about using behavioral science techniques. And that was, I think, in part because they were accessible to everybody. Way back when, these neuromarketing tools were really only available to the big brands of the world, the Coca-Colas, the BMWs, but anybody could use Robert Cialdini's principles of influence. Anybody could use some of the many cognitive biases that have been shown that people have to improve their marketing. And as a result, I was kind of steered by my audience in that direction. And as a result, my first book, Brainfluence, really was not that much about consumer neuroscience tools, but incorporated a lot more behavioral science tools.
Yeah, speaking of Brainfluence, one of my favorite books. Oops, there it is. As you can see, it's well tabbed and underlined and highlighted and notations.
I love to see that, DJ. Whenever somebody shows me a book that's I've been thumbed through and it's got scribbles in it and whatnot, that really is good for my heart.
That's what I do. I tear books apart. Yeah, Brainfluence is a fantastic read, and it's really dives into behavioral science, behavioral economics, a little bit of neuroscience. Of course, you're probably a fan of Martin Lindstrom. I know you read Gerald Zaltman as well, both great experts in the space. But as I was looking at your book, Friction, I will summarize it this way. All friction, real or perceived, requires precious resources, mental or physical, and we're hardwired to conserve energy. Therefore, we avoid friction pretty much at all costs because we're really hardwired to avoid that mental and or physical energy. Would you say that's a fair assessment of the concepts that you so eloquently write about in your book, Friction.
Right. Just for our audience folks who may not be familiar with friction, or at least the common definition of friction that you and I know. In my book, I define friction as any unnecessary effort to perform a task. If you're trying to accomplish something on a website and there's extra effort required because it's confusing, or there's a long form to fill out where a shorter form would suffice, that would be friction. But fundamentally, DJ, the idea has its roots in the ideas of Daniel Kahneman, who sadly our Nobel Prize winner that we lost earlier this year, but really a fantastic thinker in the behavioral economics space. And he says that there is a law of least effort that applies to both cognitive and physical exertion. And he says people will gravitate to the least demanding path. And I think that that concept really is what underlies the book Friction, and really every marketer should have in mind that your customers are always looking for the least demanding path, and that could be your competitor if your path is too effortful.
Well said. So tell us, because you're obviously steeped in this and have wrote a couple of books about it, but tell us about friction in the user experience, friction on a website. I know you delve a lot into that, in your presentations and your books, but for our audience who are e-commerce executives, explain what that looks like.
Yeah, I'll do that, DJ. Now, one thing that really drives me a little bit crazy is people think that they know all about friction. I've encountered many people who I say, well, yeah, I'd like to talk about friction. Oh, no, we know all about that. We need something a little more novel and more innovative, something different. If people knew all about friction, why is there so much of it? Even today, in so many companies, user experience, customer experience, whether it's on the web, mobile app, in their retail environment or whatever. I think it's the sort of lip service when people say, oh yes, we're customer centric. And of course, their policies are not very customer friendly. I think it's, oh yeah, we've eliminated all of friction, but they really haven't. And just to explain, like websites are great examples. I mean, even today, logging onto a site to make a hotel reservation, suddenly I'm presented with like a series of CAPTCHAs where I've got to identify fire hydrants or crosswalks or, pictures without cars or crazy stuff. I mean, is this really necessary? And just the number of form fields, sometimes the number of keystrokes.
My next question is, in your mind, with our desire to collect first-party data, do you think we're also creating more and more friction as a result?
Well, I think if you have any kind of a field to collect information from, any kind of a form to collect information from a customer, the fewer fields will get a higher completion rate, a higher successful completion rate. That's been studied a lot of times and just about always true. And so if you can eliminate some data element, like, do you really need your customer's fax number these days? I've still once in a while run into that on a form. It's like, really? There's a lot of stuff that you don't need. And also, if you're asking for more information, do you need the person's title? Really? I mean, maybe you can figure that out some other way, or you just don't need it. I mean, it's nice to have all this stuff. It'd be great to have a complete profile of every inquiry, but you have to figure out what you can live with and make it very easy to do. One particular strategy I've seen, DJ, for getting some of that customer information is to use a micro commitment strategy. And this is based partly on Ryan Levesque's Ask method, where instead of giving people a long form, you start off by doing a little pop-up where you ask them one question, a simple question like gender, maybe not so simple these days, but still not very threatening. Most people answer that, and then move on to something else like general age, like a broad age bracket or something. So people can answer this stuff without feeling threatened. They don't feel like they're giving up anything too personal. But then as you get a little bit farther with another pop-up and another pop-up, I think a typical might be 6 or 8 of these things. So it's not excessive, but you can get a little more detailed and a little more effortful because the person has already made this commitment to getting the information that they want at the end of it. And they're usually promised something. They're going to get some insight into whether it's a self-improvement thing or some aspect of the personality or their golf game or whatever it could be. There's sort of a payoff at the end. And then the very last question, after you've put in, filled out maybe 7 or 8 questions that includes some more detailed information near the end, then, okay, we now know what your management style is, or your golf swing style is, or whatever. Just enter your email address and we'll send it to you. And at that point, they get a very high completion rate because somebody is really committed to this process. They want the information. They have already filled out 7 fields or something like that, or answered 7 questions. And so it's quite natural to continue. I mean, that's Bob Cialdini's principle of commitment. So I think that's one way you can get a little more information. But to me, the ideal thing is to just make it as simple and as easy as possible. Because even if you're doing it in that mode, every time you make people answer one more question, you're going to get somebody who's going to just get fed up and bail out of it.
Yeah, agreed. I would say also to that, test a progress bar. So speaking of that, what are the most common friction points that you've seen websites do that they can and should avoid? The common pitfalls in creating friction.
Well, I mean, there's probably a million of them, DJ, but I think one is the checkout process, where it is unnecessarily complicated. Too many steps, too many fields. Does a customer have to set up an account to check out? If they do, you're going to lose people there. If they can check out as a guest, that's great. If they can check out using PayPal instead of, or some other payment method, like a payment intermediary, rather than giving a company they don't really know their credit card information and having that credit card out there, knowing that someday that site might get hacked and they're going to have to get a new credit card number. That to me is one thing to do. Just make it as simple as possible. The fewest steps, fewest clicks, and minimum commitment on the part of the customer to complete the order. So again, it's wonderful to have customers set up accounts where you can market to them and all that stuff. But if you want to make the sale, make it simple and easy. I think search and product discovery are a second area that I see a lot of friction in. Some companies have very powerful search tools. If you're looking for a product, you can start typing and you'll get good suggestions in the search bar where it's auto completing for you or giving you some autocomplete suggestions that make sense. So that's one way. And then, of course, the results themselves. I think that probably the third thing is simply keeping the page design simple. If we're talking about websites, make sure that everything is absolutely clear what the customer is supposed to do next, how they can see the information they want. I think one of the things in that Zara user experience teardown was that it's really hard to figure out what to do at a given point, or hard to figure out what you were supposed to click on, how to get more information. And it should really be very intuitive, very easy to just sort of flow through that process. Ideally, what you would like is imagine a playground slide that's very slippery. You'd like somebody to start out at that slide as they enter your e-commerce store and almost just not be able to stop on the way to the checkout at the bottom, because everything is just so simple, so intuitive, and so easy. But if you've got those friction points in there, they're going to get stuck partway down and they're going to bail out.
Yeah. Well, you wrote a book on that, the Persuasion Slide.
Yeah, that was based on the playground slide, and the ideas of DJ Fogg about how we focus too much on motivating people to do stuff instead of making that stuff easier.
Yeah, exactly. That's really so true. Yeah, motivation can take you so far, but the reality is the more friction you create, even inadvertently, the more motivation is required. And sometimes you can't generate enough motivation to overcome all those little or big friction points that you've created, because one department wants a 27 field form, somebody else wants this information, somebody else wants that information, and all of a sudden it becomes this Frankenstein of forms and fields that everybody's got their hands in, because they want attribution for this, and they want this data point, and they want that data point, and all of a sudden nobody wants to figure out that form and fill it out, because the motivation isn't great enough to overcome all the friction that's been created.
Yeah, your customers just aren't that motivated in most cases. Maybe if you're a roof repair person and it's raining and somebody's got a leak, they're motivated because they want something to happen right away and they'll jump through a hoop or two. But in most cases, they're casual browsers. They don't absolutely need whatever it is they're going to buy. And they've got various places where they could buy it. I mean, you can buy anything at Amazon. So your customer's motivation level just isn't that high.
So what would you tell an e-commerce executive if you were to give them 3 tips to reduce friction on their website, what would those 3 tips be?
Well, okay, one of them I think is a kind of a research tip. I would watch some regular people use your website to buy something. And I don't mean employees who've been pushed into doing it or professional testers who work for testing companies. Find some typical people. Ask your mom. There's actual book out called The Mom Test, which I think it's one of those books where you don't really even need to read the book once you know the title. But I would have people who aren't familiar with the company, aren't familiar with the website, try and accomplish a task there and observe them carefully and watch where they get stuck. You're going to find that, oh, hey, we thought that was totally obvious, but people are getting hung up there for some reason. They're not sure where to go next. But they're not sure how to find the product they're looking for. The search box is hard to see or something. You'll find those friction points, and then that enables you to eliminate them. And to me, rather than focus, to me, testing and observation and looking at your analytics are really so important because you can see where people are failing to complete an action. You can see where they're bailing out. I think that another tool that can be used, in fact, there's free tools out there. There's Google Analytics that gives you a ton of information. There's Microsoft Clarity that's lesser known, but it's an actual behavior measurement tool that measures the behavior of people who are using your website. And that can even do things like click tracking. It can measure rage clicking when people are clicking like crazy on something that's not doing anything. But it's important to see what people clicked on that isn't clickable. And you need a different software for that. When you find that people are clicking on something that is not actually clickable, and you will. I guarantee it. If you've never done click tracking, you're going to find people are clicking on a headline or something and you say, well, you go to your designer, well, hey, why are people clicking on this? And the designer will say, well, that's because they're stupid. And no, if a lot of people are clicking on something, it's the design that's stupid. And you need to either make that thing clickable, going to wherever it would logically go to, or you need to make whatever they're supposed to click on much more visible. And, one other interesting story about the value of click tracking. In one case, a company had 5 bullet points, or product benefits, and they weren't clickable. It was just a list of bullets. And what they found was that people were clicking on these things, hoping they'd get more information. But 2 of the bullets were getting a lot more clicks than the others. So not only did they realize that people wanted more information about these benefits, but they realized which benefits appeared to be of most interest to their customers, all from looking at clicks that didn't go anywhere. So, there's a lot of things you can do to better understand what your customers are doing, what your users are doing, and really turn that into actionable strategies.
Yeah, that's a really good feedback. In fact, I always try to advocate where it's appropriate that an e-commerce store on their homepage and the hero image is to have those checkboxes or bullet points or start items that are both a decision aid and a value prop tool. So, for example, you could have, if you're selling 4 main categories of products, those categories could be listed as bullet points, which would also be clickable links to those category pages. Or if they were selling things based on value or low cost or particular applications, those could also be clickable links to pages that further explain that particular value proposition, speed or price or quality or customization, right? So yeah, very, very good point. We do a lot of that heat mapping to see what people click on and to see what they think is actionable and then make it actionable. That's some of the best insights you can get on your website is heat mapping tools.
Definitely.
So our last question, Roger, and thank you so much for everything you've shared with us today. But we have our legendary $1 million question that we like to ask our experts. The question would be, what would be the most impactful or beneficial thing that an e-commerce store could do to dramatically improve their revenue? What's the one thing that would move the needle the furthest?
Well, DJ, this answer is going to be different for different companies because everybody's situation is different. But to me, the problem that I see is the checkout process. Few companies have a checkout process as straightforward and simple as Amazon's. And typically the cart abandonment rate is like in the 70% range, and most recent stats are in that range. Now, not everybody puts something in a shopping cart because they're about to buy it. Sometimes they put it there to check the shipping or other stuff, which maybe that's a clue too. Maybe you should make it clear what that is without people having to put stuff in their cart. But regardless, what you want to do is minimize that cart abandonment rate. You want people to, if they've decided to put a product there, you want them to complete that checkout process. And of course, one way that Amazon does that is by not having, you don't have to use a cart. You can simply click buy with one click and it'll skip the entire cart process, which if you can implement that, that to me would be something that would probably dramatically improve conversion rate, reduce cart abandonment, and so on.
Absolutely, 100%. Well, Roger, it's been such an amazing pleasure to have you on our show. And again, if you've not read Friction, you have to read Friction. It's one of my favorite books on behavioral science. It really gets inside the psyche of avoiding friction and why people don't do what you want and expect them to do based on the friction points, whether they be conscious or unconscious, that have been created in the buyer journey on the website, through the checkout process, the homepage, the category page, the product pages, the forms, you name it. Every single touch point needs to be looked at under a microscope and dissected to analyze if there's any friction that can be either eliminated or reduced. And the book has a lot of examples in that, not only for websites, but government and businesses and industry alike. But it's a great read, highly recommend it. And Roger, thanks again so much for sharing your wisdom, your insights, and your decades of experience around behavioral science, and particularly the subject of this episode, which is identifying and removing friction from your website. Thanks again.
Well, thanks for having me, DJ.
Thank you.